Think about those really high-stakes moments when a team is under immense pressure, like a critical care air transport team maybe. Mid-flight, patient takes a sudden turn.
Yeah, incredibly stressful situations.
Exactly. And their ability to adapt, to just shift gears instantly, it's everything. But it makes you wonder, how do we actually measure that?
Measure the adaptation itself.
Yeah, like objectively. How well are they really doing it?
Yeah.
Beyond just, watching, getting a feeling for it.
Well, that's precisely the question tackled in a really interesting new research article we're diving into today.
Okay.
It's titled Dynamic Measures of Team Adaptation. The authors are Jamie C. Gorman from Arizona State University,
Okay.
David A.P. Grimm and Christopher W. Wiese, both from Georgia Tech,
Right.
F. Eric Robinson from the Naval Medical Research Unit in Dayton, Jennifer L. Winner from the Air Force Research Lab, and Cameron Roudebush from Aptima Inc.
Quite a team behind the research itself.
Absolutely. And their paper, it's coming out in Human Factors in 2025, is all about developing these dynamic ways to actually quantify team adaptation.
So our mission for this deep dive then is to kind of unpack what they found.
Exactly. We want to pull out the key insights, get a clearer picture of how we can objectively measure team adaptation, and maybe understand why it's so important.
Makes sense. So where did they start? What was the problem they were trying to solve?
Well, the core issue was this long-standing reliance on, let's say, subjective assessments. An observer watches a team and says, yeah, they adapted well.
Kind of the gut feeling thing I mentioned.
Precisely. And these researchers saw a real gap there. They felt we needed more objective, theoretically grounded metrics, something based on how teams actually think and work together.
Okay, so they identified the need for less subjectivity. What did they propose instead? What are these dynamic measures?
The idea stems from team cognition theory, basically, how teams share and process information. They focus specifically on communication.
How the team talks to each other.
Exactly. They looked at how team communication patterns change, how they reorganize in real time, especially when faced with a challenge. They call this communicative adaptation.
Communicative adaptation. Okay, I can see that. When things go wrong, the way you talk definitely shifts.
Yeah.
So how did they test this?
They got data from these critical care air transport team training simulations, really high fidelity stuff.
Like almost real.
Pretty close. You had teams, a physician, a nurse, and a respiratory therapist dealing with simulated patients whose conditions were deteriorating rapidly.
Intense.
Very. And they collected data from 85 different teams across 4 different challenging scenarios.
85 teams. That's a solid amount of data. And these scenarios, they had built in difficult moments.
Yeah, the paper calls them perturbations, points where things got significantly harder for the team, forcing them to adapt.
Okay, so how did they quantify the communication changes during these perturbations? You mentioned dynamic measures.
Right. They used 2 main techniques, moving window entropy and recurrence-based determinism.
Whoa, okay, big technical there. Can you break those down?
Yeah, let's simplify. Think of entropy as measuring the variety or unpredictability in the team's communication. Are they saying lots of different things, interacting in varied ways?
So more flexible communication might mean higher entropy.
Kind of, yeah. More variety. Then, determinism measures the opposite, how predictable or repetitive the communication patterns are. Are they falling into the same conversational loops?
Okay, so entropy is variety. Determinism is predictability or pattern repetition.
You got it. The idea is that adapting might involve changing these patterns, maybe becoming less predictable, showing more variety when faced with a new challenge.
Right. But did these communication measures actually link to how well the teams did? Did they validate them?
They did. They compared these communication scores to actual performance outcomes. One was objective.
T-Z.
Yeah, T-Z. It measures the total time the simulated patient's vital signs were outside the target range. So lower T-Z means better patient care, essentially.
Ah, okay. A direct measure of medical success.
Exactly. And they also use a subjective rating called time window, which was basically an instructor's assessment of how quickly the team achieved the training objectives.
Got it. Objective patient status and subjective speed. So what did they find when they put it all together? What were the big results?
Well, first off, a really key finding. These dynamic measures, entropy and determinism, they actually predicted team performance across all 4 different scenarios.
All 4. So it wasn't just specific to one type of problem.
No, which suggests these measures have some general applicability. They seem to capture something fundamental about team adaptation. Regardless of the specific challenge, it points towards them being robust tools.
That's pretty significant. What else stood out?
They also found that teams reorganize their communication patterns more during those stressful perturbation segments compared to the more routine normal segments.
So when things got tough, the communication patterns demonstrably shifted. The measures picked that up.
Precisely. It supports the idea that these measures are actually capturing that adaptive response. And it aligns with this concept called the law of requisite variety.
Law of requisite variety.
Yeah, it's the idea that for a system like a team to effectively deal with complexity or variety in its environment, the system itself needs to possess a similar level of variety or complexity.
So the team's communication needs to become more complex or varied to match the complexity of the patient's crisis.
That's the idea, yeah. But it wasn't always straightforward.
Oh, how so? Did more reorganization always mean better performance?
Not necessarily, and this is where it gets nuanced. While the measures generally predicted performance, the specific relationship between, say, higher entropy and better performance varied depending on the scenario.
So context matters a lot.
Hugely.
Well,
For instance, in one specific simulation, Simulation 3, they found something unexpected. Less reorganization, so maybe lower entropy or higher determinism, was actually linked to better performance.
less reorganization was better. Why would that be?
The researchers hypothesized that maybe that particular scenario required a more centralized leadership style. Perhaps too much back and forth, too much variety in communication was actually detrimental. Maybe what was needed was clear, directive communication from the leader.
Interesting. So it's not just adapt more, it's adapt appropriately for the specific situation.
You've nailed it. It highlights that effective adaptation is context-dependent. What works in one crisis might not work in another.
So when they looked at the specific correlations, did they generally see, like, higher entropy linking to better patient outcomes? Except for that one scenario.
Yes, in several cases, they found significant correlations in the directions they initially hypothesized. For example, higher entropy or lower determinism correlating with better patient status, lower T-Z, or faster completion times. But again, those unexpected findings, like in Simulation 3, really emphasize that context is key.
This sounds incredibly useful, moving beyond just theory. Are there practical applications being developed from this?
Absolutely. This research isn't just sitting in a journal. It's directly feeding into a tool called the Team Dynamics Measurement System, or TDMS.
PDMS, what does that do?
It's designed to be used in training. It automatically analyzes team communication using speech data to assess team dynamics in real time or near real time.
Wow. So it listens to the team talk during a simulation and gives feedback based on these dynamic measures we've been discussing.
That's the goal. TDMS has different parts, but relevant here is the Team Adaptation and Reorganization module. It uses these principles, entropy, determinism, to give instructors objective data on how the team is adapting its communication.
So it's like giving the instructors extra eyes and ears, but focus specifically on these objective communication patterns.
Exactly. It supplements their own expert observations with quantitative data about the team's adaptive processes.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. The big takeaway seems to be that we can measure team adaptation objectively by looking at communication dynamics, like entropy and determinism.
Right. We can move beyond just subjective feelings.
And these measures, they generally predict performance across different situations.
But crucially, how they predict performance depends heavily on the context. What constitutes good adaptation isn't one size fits all.
Yeah, that context piece feels really important. It gives us a much more nuanced picture than just saying teams need to adapt.
Definitely. It highlights that teamwork is this dynamic, shifting process, not just a static checklist of skills.
So thinking ahead, if we can objectively measure how and when teams adapt or reorganize, what could that mean for training? Not just in medicine, but maybe, I don't know, firefighting, military operations, even business teams.
The potential seems huge, doesn't it? Imagine tailoring training based on specific adaptation needs identified through this kind of analysis.
Or giving teams feedback not just on the outcome, but on their adaptive process during a challenge. Really makes you think about how we evaluate and develop teams.
It does. And for anyone listening who's interested in seeing a bit more about the practical side, the TDMS system we mentioned actually has a demo available online.
Oh, really? Where can people find that?
The address is tdms.mindmodel.afreesearchlab.dev.
Okay, great. tdms.mindmodel.afreesearchlab.dev. Definitely something to chew on, how measuring the dance of team communication could change how teams work.